The Real AI Podcast with Michael Hainsworth is brought to you by Microsoft.
Artificial intelligence isn't something that's coming. It's here today with real solutions to real problems, like the problem of climate change. At Natural Resources Canada, Chief Scientist Vik Pant is using machine learning to learn where the best locations for electric vehicle charging stations should be, how to identify abandoned mines and the environmental disasters they threaten, and to ensure that our appliances are energy efficient and reducing our carbon footprint. He says we should think about sustainability at two levels.
One is conscientious stewardship, the other is responsible consumption. But what does this mean operationally? So to me, operationally, when we talk about sustainability, you can think about it in many ways, but the way I like to think about it is effectiveness and efficiency. And we can think about effectiveness as doing the right things and efficiency as doing things right.
But how do we employ artificial intelligence efficiently and do things right? The answers to these questions and more on Real AI, brought to you by Microsoft.
It's very important to understand, for example, in Canada, where our abandoned and inactive mines are. Now, this is an important thing because we certainly want to know where these structures are, because we want to be able to minimize any kind of ecological hazards that they can create if they are sort of left unchecked and they're left unmonitored. But on the other side, we also want to ensure that from a public safety perspective, that these kinds of abandoned and sort of inactive mines don't create all kinds of problems, depending on how close they may be to some places of habitation. Now, one way to do this kind of mapping, if you will, of these abandoned and inactive mines is to actually go out and to actually refer to old maps and go out and see what's out there. And certainly you always have a risk that the old maps may not have full knowledge of abandoned and inactive mines. So really, it's an important goal, but if you do it in that manual way, it's not really that effective. Now, that being said, today, what do we have? We have access to satellite imagery. We have access to aerial photography from drones, from hot air balloons, from aircrafts, many from the public sector, which are collected by space agencies, but also many from citizen scientists, many from other research institutes, universities, and the like. So imagine, Michael, if you take all of this satellite imagery and you have some annotated data sets where you have some known ground truth of this is what a abandoned or inactive mine structure looks like from top down, then you can train a machine learning model and then run that on your data set and get an up-to-date map of abandoned and inactive mines, which then you can update through time and over time much faster than you'd be able to if you were actually sending humans out to do this kind of data collection. In terms of efficiency, a good example I'd like to use is we have a very interesting project on essentially how online retailers use the Energy Star logo. So the Energy Star is a program which is something that the government of Canada and the US is involved in, and it has a brand, it has a certain logo, and the way to use that logo is enshrined into some set of rules. Now, if you were to go to manually into all the possible online retailers where products, appliances like washing machines, refrigerators, dishwashers, etc., are being labeled with the Energy Star logo, that's not something that can be done humanly at any scale. But using artificial intelligence to power some kind of a spider or a crawler to go out and to crawl these websites and see where those types of logos are being used, see where references to Energy Star is being made, Michael, and bring it back and compare it to the gold standard and cross-check that against the registry of approved uses, we can very, very quickly find out if there is misuse or abuse or fraud of the Energy Star logo. So just two quick examples of where AI is helping to advance the goals of sustainability.
So you're looking through large data sets for consumption patterns on appliances that have the Energy Star logo, to figure out if they're still compliant with the ever-evolving standards?
That could be one part of it, Michael. The other part of it could also be if, for instance, there is some kind of deceptive or fraudulent advertising where people are using variations on the Energy Star logo, which from a distance looks like it's Energy Star, but it's really not Energy Star. So absolutely, because these standards may change over time, and there is a rigorous process through which appliances and devices have to be certified. So once we have this kind of Energy Star detective tool, Michael, we can use it to solve all kinds of problems related to, like you said, checking compliance with changing standards, as well as making sure that it's not being misused or fraudulently abused.
With the ultimate goal of reducing the consumption of electricity.
Absolutely, because these devices are Energy Star compliant, and these Energy Star compliant devices have to have a certain input-output profile. They have to have a certain profile in terms of how much electricity they consume to deliver the utility that they deliver. And only if certain thresholds are met is that device Energy Star certified. So as long as we can ensure that devices that are truly Energy Star compliant are being advertised as such and being consumed as such, that we can ensure that that electricity consumption can be reduced in that way.
This just illustrates the wide variety of use cases for artificial intelligence. You start by talking about making sure that abandoned mines aren't leaching chemicals into the soil, to whether or not that appliance I'm buying online actually is going to help the planet by reduced energy consumption.
Absolutely, Michael. Yes, that's right. And there's many myriad of use cases. I always like to tell my team and I tell my partners and colleagues that really there are so many interesting data sets out there that we need to be creative in the ways in which we think that we can apply algorithms and techniques to do machine learning, Michael, to derive insights from these disparate data sets to solve a myriad of different problems.
So you're collaborating in a sort of a public-private partnership to ensure that AI is used for good.
I'm a firm believer in the truism that nobody knows everything and everybody knows something. And that's important because when we think about artificial intelligence, just think about, Michael, how quickly there's this rapid advance. Every day, it seems there's a new breakthrough announcement in terms of an algorithm or some kind of new machine learning technique. Think about data. I mean, data are being collected at extremely fast rate, volume, variety, the 4 V's of data. That's really growing very, very fast. And on top of which, the kinds of awareness that folks have in terms of how machine learning can be applied on massive data sets to solve ever more complex kinds of problems, that it's very, very interesting to think that no one organization actually has all the data, all the technology, and all the brain power to solve some of those big problems. And especially we're talking about sustainability. We just talked about 2 or 3 use cases. I mean, this is a big field. So public-private partnerships are great for 3 reasons, as I mentioned. One of them certainly is the people. So I'll give you an example, Michael. From our perspective in our department, we have world-leading scientists, we have world-leading policy experts. And so their knowledge is obviously very, very important because that's domain knowledge. But equally importantly, we want to make sure that if we're applying machine learning and data science, that we have the data science expertise in-house, but we're not the only ones. There's lots of universities, organizations like Microsoft and others that also have amazing data scientists. So bring that knowledge pool together, number one. Number 2, bring the technology together. So we've built some of our own software over the years, but we also recognize that outside of our department, there are lots of great organizations, whether it's universities or companies building software. So let's bring the software together and the data sets. So that is the most interesting part of it, is where certainly we have access to lots of data. Other members of the Canadian government family have lots of data, but private sector also has lots of data. So let's get these things together. Let's align on mutual goals, on our shared objectives, and really create a win-win situation, Michael, where we can come together, work together, and help each other to solve these big problems.
That's fascinating because we talk about data as the new oil, as the real currency in the 21st century and in the 4th industrial revolution. Yet you're talking about partnerships with private companies. I think it would be my natural assumption that a company would be unwilling to share their big data pool in a public-private partnership like that.
This is a very interesting question, Michael. And, this is something that I've seen some very interesting economics research now coming out of universities and of think tanks. You're exactly right. Data on the one side is an asset, just like any other asset. You can have a building, you can have a fleet of vehicles. So it is an asset. But what's very interesting about data is that data is the value of data is idiosyncratic in that you may have a data set that you control as a company, and that gives you, let's assume, some measure of utility. Now you have some other organization that has their own data set that gives them a certain measure of utility. But if you only look at the value of data in that isolated context or that separated context, you're only kind of looking at the superficial or the sort of the explicit nature of value of data. What's interesting is when you put data sets together, or as the expression goes, when you intermix data sets, the whole, as the truism holds, is greater than the sum of the parts. And so you end up in a situation where, yes, you may want to, as an organization, hold on to your data, and somebody else may want to hold on to their data because you know that it creates some measure of value for you. But in fact, in many cases, when you put those data sets together, the value amplification, the value multiplication that takes place, and the shares that each party can then divide from that surplus is actually more than any kind of loss that they can encounter if, for example, they were not to share that data, or if they shared the data and somehow the data got misappropriated. And the other part of that is the technology is now around, Michael, where, in the old days when you gave somebody data on a USB stick or on an email, that's it. You have no control over what they do with it. But now there are technologies like data trusts, where it's not just that when Vik gives Michael some data, Michael can make a clone of it and do whatever they want with it, irrespective of what Vik and Michael had agreed on. So from my perspective, Michael, this notion of the technology in terms of data trusts, which ensure that when parties exchange data, they can only be used in ways that are authorized and permitted by both parties as a part of their agreement, and also the awareness of the economic, the complementarity aspect, the latent nature of value of data. When you put data sets together, a whole new kind of data potential gets unlocked, value potential gets unlocked, Michael. I think that's what's bringing a lot of these private sector players to the table to want to collaborate.
We've talked a little bit about how AI is helping sustainability in the mining industry, how it's helping with something as simple as a consumer sticker on the side of an appliance. But you're also involved in EV charging. And what's fascinating to me is that we can apply artificial intelligence to help us with our sustainability goals directly, like mining or Energy Star, but also indirectly. How are you doing that with EV charging stations?
That's a great question. So for sure, one of our priorities is to have a network of electric vehicle charging stations from coast to coast to coast. We can think about these modern electric vehicles as smart connected batteries, Michael, computers that happen to have a wheel and a and a trunk and some seats and a door and a windshield. But the reality is these are computers. These are mobile computers with 5G or 4G connections, depending on where you are, Wi-Fi connectivity, Bluetooth sensors, IoT, all of it. So the reality is that these kinds of devices, these computational platforms, are accumulating all kinds of information about the drivers or the owners, one can presume, of those electric vehicles, where they live, where they drive to, presumably to work, what routes they take, where they charge their vehicles, when they charge their vehicles. So these machines are collecting all kinds of behavioral information about people that own and operate these electric vehicles. And that kind of information can be very, very important in figuring out the geospatial placement of these EV charging stations. We certainly don't want to put EV charging stations, for example, where there aren't that many people that own EV vehicles or that work that own EV vehicles. So that's one part of it. But then there's another piece to it which is very important. These are sort of endogenous factors to the drivers and their behavior. But there's lots of other things which are involved as well, right? So think about how the electricity goes into the battery in the first place when it's plugged into an EV port. Is there has to be a power plant, there has to be a transformer, a substation, a distribution grid, a whole entire network of the electricity infrastructure that gets that voltage from production into the battery. So that's another factor we need to keep in mind as well, is we need to bear in mind sort of where the different components of the energy infrastructure are, to ensure that if we are accounting for the behaviors of owners of EVs vis-a-vis their charging behaviors, but we also need to make sure that we can get enough electricity there to those points in the charging network in the right way in the first place. So it's a very interesting problem, is to build an ensemble of different types of machine learning models which can be used on the one side to predict the behaviors of the people that own and charge electric vehicles, and on the other side ensure that sort of the production of the electricity and the transmission and the distribution of the electricity to those charging points is such that it's viable and that it's feasible through time. And then finding that intersection, Michael, where that can happen together is really what this kind of a project helps to solve.
Right. When you think or see a headline about how the government wants to put EV charging stations right across the country, your first thought might be, well, they're going to put them equidistant to each other, but you would end up with units that would never get used.
Absolutely, Michael. You're exactly right. And the beauty of any kind of artificial intelligence problem or project is that, today, let's assume we're using behavior data from the drivers, and we're using data from the electricity producers and distributors, as well as, let's say, data about environment and climate change. That's interesting. But in the future, there may be some other kind of study that finds out that, hey, here's another data set which is now relevant to take the analysis to an even better place. Then certainly moving forward, we can bring that data set in, train some models on top of that, and then put that into our ensemble as well to then further calibrate and fine tune and optimize, Mike, our intended placement of where these charging stations can actually go. So it's not something that once, it's set in stone, the model is trained, it's fixed. It's something that as long as there's flexibility in the program to find new places to put these, we can always iteratively, incrementally improve the quality of those predictions and the real life decisions which they inform.
I'd like to come back to one of the use cases that you touched on, which was mining. It's fascinating to me that the mining industry is jumping on board artificial intelligence. I would always have assumed that this was an old economy industry that wasn't interested in innovation.
Interesting point, Michael. What I've found is that, in fact, they are very much embracing of modern technologies and very sophisticated in their thinking in terms of the values versus value conversation, if you will. I think that gone are the days when certainly Canadian industry in this space are operating under the old only economic value model. In fact, I think purely from a competitiveness perspective, folks are now very, very cognizant of, as end consumers like you or I are very conscientious about where minerals and metals are coming from that go into the products that we buy. So certainly we want to ensure that they're affordable, but we also want to ensure that affordability doesn't come at the trade-off of all kinds of other factors such as environmental, such as ecological, sustainability goals. So I think Canadian operators are very avant-garde in their thinking, and they are quite ahead of the pack on a global scale, if you will, global stage. So there's certainly a competitiveness argument to be made that we want to have mines which are efficient and effective vis-a-vis sustainability goals, ecological, environmental goals and objectives. So there's certainly the economic argument to be made, but also from a productivity argument that could be made as well. I'll give you an example. So in many cases, when you have mines and you have certain parts of mines that you haven't fully explored yet, or you haven't fully figured out exactly what the resource yield potential is or something like that, it may require you to do a lot of experimentation in the real world to figure out whether or not to go and further develop that part of a mine or not. Now what we have is technology like digital twins, which Mike is quite much in the news nowadays, where we can build these computational analogs which are essentially virtual equivalents, if you will, of a physical mine, and you can actually have sensors, probes, detectors, instruments in the real mine in real time or in near real time, feeding data into these computational analogs, which can then be used to do all kinds of simulations, all kinds of forecasting. And now you can imagine that if you can do a lot of computational forecasts and simulations in these digital twins, if you will, of these mines, then it really reduces the search space of the kind of exploration you have to do in the real world. And so it's not just a time saving at that point, it also then makes you more productive as a mine operator, and it also helps you to do a lot of this kind of testing without necessarily creating disturbances or upsetting certain structures in the mine that can then lead to other kinds of environmental impacts. So I would say certainly that mining companies in Canada are very advanced and very sophisticated in the way some are actually exploring it a little bit more than others, but the reality is that as a whole, there's a lot of appetite for looking at AI, data science, big data brought into a mining context to really advance the kind of great work that can be done in these kinds of mines.
So mining creates a remarkable amount of toxic waste. Let's sort of put a bow on this mining component to the conversation and explain how, at the end of the day, ultimately AI helps remove that toxic waste.
Absolutely. And I want to go back to a very interesting point that you had made about sort of effluents leaching into the ground and potentially going into underground. There's many different ways and far too many to mention just in quickly, but I'll give you a very concrete example. I talked about this notion of orphaned and inactive mines. Well, when people think about mines, they think about a mine as one physical sort of entity where there is a hole or there's some kind of a pit or some kind of a opening in the ground. But actually, a mine is a whole structure. It is an entire collection of different artifacts on the ground, some which are below ground, that come together for that mine to operate. Now, there is the notion of what's called a tailing pond, and a tailing pond, as the name suggests, is where a lot of the emissions and the effluents are actually stored, they're dammed, and as you touched on in your opening, is that a big risk is if that tailing pond dam breaks, that effluent, that chemical residue can leak into the waterways, the watersheds, or even if that dam doesn't break, if it stays there for too long and it can sort of decay through the ground and go into groundwater. So it can create all kinds of ecological issues, which then downstream can expose the public to massive, funds needing to be spent to then correct and remediate these kinds of disasters. So a very interesting thing is that when I use the example of using satellite imagery to have computer vision applied to images of aerial photography to identify these inactive and abandoned mines. So it's not just that it actually is identifying the abandoned mine as a blob. It's actually these kinds of models are able to identify the different substructures within the structure of an abandoned or an inactive mine. So it can actually tell you that here is an abandoned mine, here is another abandoned mine, but this abandoned mine has a tailing pond which is 6 times bigger than the one which is there, and for some reason this one mine is actually closer to human habitation than that one. And so you can use that kind of analysis, for example, to do some preemptive type of actions to perhaps drain those, or to do some kind of other chemical processes to neutralize the chemicals in them. So just a simple example that I shared with you, Mike, of how using techniques like computer vision on satellite imagery or aerial photography can help us to identify abandoned and inactive mines. Some would be confirmatory, some would be ones that confirm what was known, others would be new ones that were skipped from previous maps. But one way or the other, you can not only identify them, but then you can compare them with other mines to build a prioritization strategy that can inform your planning exercise for how you're going to go deal with it preemptively as opposed to after some disaster occurs.
Okay, so we're using AI to ensure that when we either abandon a mine or we're actively using a mine, that we don't have the toxic chemicals leaching out into the groundwater and ultimately affecting wildlife and humans. But what about the sustainability side of it when it comes to the incredible amount of energy that mining requires just to operate? How do we address the greenhouse gas emissions in that industry through AI?
Absolutely. And, this is why it's important to understand that when we look at the energy profile, and there's a topic of green mining, for instance, that often comes up of having mines that are ecologically sustainable, that are environmentally friendlier than, let's assume, other mines which are not. When we're looking at the energy profile of a mine, it's not just the energy that's going into the mine. We also have to look upstream and figure out, okay, well, how was that energy produced in the first place that actually came in to this mine? So if we were to split this up into two different analyses, looking inside the mine, certainly a great example would be, and you touched on, IoT-based sensors. Even if a lot of old mining equipment is mechanical and it's equipment that requires some kind of it's not automated, we can now retrofit those kinds of equipments with these computers or with these types of control arrays, which are in fact modern. They do connect to 5G, they do connect to 4G or to Wi-Fi or Bluetooth and whatnot. And so what we can now do is that even though that old device was not geared towards environmentally friendly operation perhaps, or some other ecologically sustainable sort of operation, what we can now do is we can actually fit it with more modern components, or if we can piecemeal upgrade certain parts of it to now make sure that moving forward, these sensors are in fact now monitoring how that piece of equipment is functioning. And so there could be times when you realize that the machine is idling, or the machine should be idling. It's running, but it's actually not processing anything. So maybe it should be switched to an idle state or something like that. So individually, by equipment, we can go and do where reasonable these kinds of retrofits, which are bringing in the IoT power, the connectivity power, the AI power to the edge, right to that actual device. So decisions are being made directly on that device of when it should cycle on, when it should cycle off, based on all kinds of things that a human would otherwise have to be doing. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is the digital twinning part, where a significant amount of energy in a mine would go not just towards production operations, but also experiments and also towards new discovery and new exploration. So if not all of it, but if some of it could be performed computationally in a digital twin, That would also reduce the GHG profile of the mine itself. And then we go upstream. So then we look at where is this energy being produced? How is it being transmitted? And so just like I talked about in the previous example, where we can train these ensembles of models that can predict how the mine is going to be using electricity through time or energy through time, and then how the supply stations or the grids which are powering that mine are going to produce energy. We can then take the predictions from those different models, bring them together to harmonize some predictions that can give us a good decision. So overall, producing only the energy upstream as cleanly as possible to power the mines, while inside the mine ensuring that the minimal amount of energy is being used to do what it is that the mine needs to do to be successful and operational.
All right, let's go from underground to a 10,000-foot view of artificial intelligence. You've partnered with Microsoft on AI for business with the AI Business School. You're not trying to put MBAs out of work, are you?
No, and Michael, that's a great question. As somebody that has one of those degrees, I do find it to be a very useful degree, and I find that is MBAs bring a lot to the table. It's interesting, as a side note, on social media nowadays, there's a big debate taking place on the value of this degree or the value of that degree, and MBAs do seem to get caught quite a bit in that crossfire. No, I think, the way I look at it is, yes, we're a government department and we are partnering with Microsoft on AI Business School, but really, I think that the name ought to be AI Value School. And to your point on MBA, that's the biggest lesson I took away from my MBA was this focus on value. Because at the end of the day, if you're investing in AI, if you're investing in any kind of technology or any asset writ large, you have to be able to justify a return on investment. Otherwise, your leadership is not going to let that investment go through. And how you actually come up with what that value looks like or how you measure value, that is something that is a non-trivial problem. It's not a settled science. It's not like, and I certainly don't want to trivialize this either, but when you think about building a new building, a plant, or buying a new fleet of vehicles, even there, doing ROI justifications are hard because, how do we know exactly what value that those assets are going to contribute? AI, this problem becomes even more complicated because now you're talking about systems, you're talking about data, you're thinking about all kinds of other factors which are getting involved from a socio-technical complex systems perspective. So we really like this notion of AI Business School, or what I'm going to start calling AI Value School, because Microsoft has put together some very interesting content that brings the focus of AI conversations from the what to the so what. And that so what is the value, because a lot of times AI is sort of regarded as a shiny new object, and there's all these stories and all this amazing sort of rhetoric about AI, and some of it is quite sensational for the right reasons. But I think as responsible officials, as responsible leaders in organizations, it's important, just like any other investment, just like any other asset, Mike, to bring that back to the value conversation, because an AI is also not monolithic. So what kind of AI? How much? How little? How do we know that it's doing something that we needed to do from a strategic priorities and planning perspective? So certainly not trying to put MBAs out of business. Very much appreciate the economic mindedness that MBAs bring to a table to problem solve. And I really do feel that this AI Value School, so-called AI Business School, is going to help our department to really put the focus on the so what as much as it is on the what.
I had an opportunity to talk more about AI Business School with John Weigalt. He's the National Technology Officer at Microsoft, and he had some remarkably complimentary things to say about the work NRCan is doing.
So our role in working with NRCan is to help get that business school out to as many people as possible. So NRCan, as a leader in innovation and in AI, is seen as that North Star within government. And working with NRCan, we are looking to expand the AI Business School across not only that department, but across government generally.
One of the lessons that AI Business School teaches the enterprise world is that if you're building artificial intelligence into your organization, you have to do it ethically.
Absolutely. So there are 6 principles in responsible AI. Fairness, making sure that everybody is treated fairly by the AI, that it doesn't distinguish upon gender, upon race, around ethnicity, any of those things. There's safety. We need to make sure that AI is reliable and always makes the same decision in the same way. Privacy and security, always want to make sure that that maintains privacy and that it's secure. We've seen in some places that it can be quite easy to trick unsophisticated AI models. Inclusiveness, we want to make sure that those people with special access requirements, think of people with mobility challenges or have different ways to access computing, still are treated fairly and included within AI. Accountability, making sure that people are in the loop of making decisions. And again, transparency, making sure we understand how AI makes its decisions.
Leveraging the Internet of Things is critical in this fourth industrial revolution. And Weigelt says AI Business School is teaching corporations just how important it is.
The Internet of Things, in my mind, is a really, really exciting place. We are able to put in sensors into what are previously thought to be kind of boring environments, into the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, into the vent systems into buildings. At Microsoft, we put an instrument into one of the vents in a parking garage, and it recognized or showed us that vent stayed open in the winter months, and it was releasing hot air out into the environment. Once we understood that, we were able to close that vent and save $30,000 a year on heating costs just for that one different element. Imagine if you can do that across your entire building, your office structure, or your business units.
John Weigelt is the National Technology Officer at Microsoft Canada. Vik, let's get back to you. There are some within the corner office who are looking at artificial intelligence as a box you buy, you put it on a shelf, you plug it into the network, and you walk away. Part of the role of the AI Business School is to teach the C-suite?
Absolutely. Teach the C-suite and also that's a really good question, because it's to teach the C-suite, it's to also teach all other levels of management and operating staff. But that's not all. It's also making the connections between those layers, Mike. And I feel that oftentimes is what gets a bit confused, because, at the one level, you have people that are deep technical experts who also have a lot of domain knowledge, who are actually building these AI systems and seeing benefits, actually realizing value, seeing AI systems make contributions to attain the goals of the organization. But as it may go up the chain, if there isn't that degree of understanding of what AI has done, what it can do, but not just the pros, but also some potential risks and challenges and obstacles and cons, then by the time what reaches up to the decision-making layer at the very top, as you said, the C-suite, it could be a distorted or a misleading view of really what the true potential and the true realization of AI is. So you've raised a great point, is whereas this program, to the extent that I've seen it, not only talks about kind of layer by layer what every sort of person at every level needs to know, but also how to communicate effectively across layers to ensure that the messaging is going intact, top to bottom and bottom to top.
Vik Pant is the Chief Scientist at Natural Resources Canada. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the Real AI Podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe today and visit Microsoft.com/AI to see exciting real-world examples of real AI in use today.